Here we will examine the organization of whole skeletal muscles. Each skeletal muscle is an organ because it has tissue types other than muscle tissue that are associated with it. So it contains the muscle fibers, which was also the term that we used for the muscle cells. It contains nerves, blood vessels, and connective tissues that bind and hold it together. One nerve is generally found within each whole muscle, and then that nerve has multiple nerve endings that will branch from that one nerve and control each of the individual muscle cells within that skeletal muscle. So in this diagram, we see the whole skeletal muscle and we see the skeletal muscle cells, which are called the muscle fibers here. And these muscle fibers are bundled together with other muscle fibers in order to form a structure called a fascicle. The plasma membrane of the skeletal muscle is referred to as the sarcolemma. So even though it has a slightly different name, it is still the same plasma membrane that we've seen in other cells. Covering the sarcolemma, so that is covering the superficial surface of each muscle fiber, is a connective tissue layer that is called the endomysium. And the endomysium is an areolar connective tissue that brings very fine blood vessels in close proximity to each skeletal muscle fiber so that it can deliver oxygen and nutrients to them. So the fascicles, or the bundles of skeletal muscle cells, are held together with a wrapping called the perimysium, which is a dense, irregular connective tissue that helps to keep the fascicle organized. So next we have the epimysium, which is a connective tissue covering that is continuous with the tendon that anchors the muscle to the bone. And just like the perimysium, the epimysium is also a layer of dense, irregular connective tissue that really just helps to keep all of the fascicles within that single skeletal muscle organized. So let's take a closer look at the muscle fiber, which is also known as the muscle cell. This diagram here shows the sarcolemma, and recall that the skeletal muscle cell is a cell just like every other cell, even though it does have some specializations in it. It's still a cell, and so it still has a plasma membrane. We see the nuclei, because remember that skeletal muscle cells are multinucleate. And we also see very abundant mitochondria, which we have a lot of mitochondria in the skeletal muscles because mitochondria are making ATP that the skeletal muscle will then use when it contracts. The sarcoplasm is the cytoplasm of the skeletal muscle cell, and we find that it occupies the space between the sarcolemma and the organelles that are contained within the skeletal muscle cell. The muscle cells also contain a lot of glycogen granules because glycogen is a form of stored glucose that the cell can then use as fuel. Particularly the mitochondria can use it as fuel to make ATP. We also see other things that are within the skeletal muscle cell, like pigments. In particular, one pigment is called myoglobin. And myoglobin is a red pigment that is similar to hemoglobin, and its job is to store oxygen. The remainder of the organelles that we see packed into the skeletal muscle cell are the contractile organelles called the myofibrils. There are often thousands of myofibrils in each muscle cell, and the myofibrils are what contain the contractile proteins that give the skeletal muscle its striated or striped appearance. So what we didn't see in the previous diagram is this web-like network of channels that surrounds each myofibril. And this network is called the Sarcoplasmic Reticulum, or the SR for short. The function of the SR is to store calcium when the muscle is at rest. And we'll see that when the muscle is stimulated, the Sarcoplasmic Reticulum will release the calcium into the fluid inside of the skeletal muscle cell, and it will cause the skeletal muscle to contract. So calcium is a very important component of skeletal muscle contraction. So also what we see is that the sarcoplasmic reticulum expands a little bit at the ends where it butts up against these tube-like structures that are called Ttubules. And Ttubules are small little tunnels of the plasma membrane that extend down to the myofibrils. And the T-tubule, the term T in T-tubule just stands for transverse. And that's because they're oriented perpendicular to the direction of the myofibrils. And we're going to see how these work a little bit later, but these are really important in helping the spread of the electrical activity of the skeletal muscle cell when it's stimulated.